Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai hara mai hoki mai anō ki Hika. Welcome to the Hika podcast. Welcome to this episode. Today it's a real pleasure and honour to have a manuhiri here with us from Tasmania. Garry Deverell is a scholar, an Anglican priest, an activist, and an all-round troublemaker. So it's great to have him here today with us on Hika as we talk about where Indigenous people, where Indigenous sovereignty, where Indigenous life is at in Australia, and where it might be headed. So kia ora, Garry, welcome. It's a real pleasure, honour to have you here with us today on Hika, and welcome to Aotearoa e hoa. Such a pleasure. Kia ora.
Thank you, Hireni. We would say ya punlinya in my language. Yeah.
Kia ora. Yeah. Welcome. Ya punlinya.
Yeah.
Oh, kia ora. Okay, Garry, so your people, and you're currently living in Tasmania. So can you tell us a little bit about where your people are from, you know, a little bit of their background and a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah. So Tasmania, of course, is a colonial name. There's a number of Indigenous names for that island, Lutruwita, Trawlwoolway. Of course, we didn't have just one language, so there's a number of different names for that part of the world. But my people are the Trawlwoolway, and they come from the sort of northeast part of the island. That's where my mob were from. Of course, we had a really terrible history with the British, like many Indigenous people do, and so we barely survived. But we're in a rebuilding phase now where we're reclaiming culture, teaching our kids language, gathering together into Indigenous organisations to look after our people, make sure that there's something to look forward to, and we're doing that kind of work at the moment. So I'm involved with an organisation called Six Rivers Aboriginal Corporation, and we work on the north coast of Lutruwita or Tasmania, and mainly working with, trying to set up Indigenous businesses to employ our kids, because it's a part of the world where unemployment is a really, really big problem and educational levels are very low. So we're trying to build hope and a future for our kids. Yeah.
Kia ora. Well, that's beautiful. And look, I think for a lot of our audience, particularly here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have sadly little knowledge of the colonisation, of the invasion of Australia. One of our past Prime Ministers, John Key, said it was great that New Zealand was settled peacefully, which is, completely untrue. And yet we think it's so much more in Australia. Like, Aboriginals, because there's just one Aboriginal people, were so peaceful, and then, they just folded and welcomed. But actually there were a lot of frontier wars in Australia, a lot of military resistance, a lot of political resistance to, and then you have invasion days. And Tasmania's got a particularly sad history in this respect, right?
Yeah.
So, what are your feelings about, when you think about the colonisation, the invasion of Tasmania in particular? Like, what does it bring to your mind? What kind of feelings does it bring to you?
Well, as you say, Hireni, it was a very brutal history. So the British arrived in 1803 to set up a penal colony. And within a 30-year period, most of our people had been killed in frontier conflicts. And largely that was over land and resource. So as the British arrived to set up their penal colony, they also brought in free settlers. Free settlers were given our land. We were driven off. There were, effectively militias that were set up by settlers to go out and hunt our people. So lots and lots of massacres, lots of poisonings of water sources and those sorts of things. And so the population of probably about 8,000 people at 1803, was reduced down to about 100 by 1830. And so it was a very, very brutal settlement. And so the words in invasion, genocide, absolutely apply in Tasmania and its history. So that's a very, very sad history. There's also sadness, of course, in the white population, the dominant white population, because many of those folks are descended from convicts. Particularly, Tasmania was a place where they sent Irish convicts who were largely political prisoners, who were sent there for fighting the British, you know. So it's very interesting in southeastern Australia, Victoria and Tasmania in particular. Many of the Aboriginal people and the descendants of the Irish convicts formed new families together, probably because of their common experience of the British. So yes, a very brutal history, but increasingly I think one that we're trying to transcend by creating a more positive future for ourselves. It's taken a very long time because it was very, very dangerous to be Aboriginal in Tasmania for many, many years. But I think particularly since the mid-1970s, probably in concert with Indigenous movements around the world around that same time, we've kind of come together and tried to create a better future. So, yeah.
Kia ora. I mean, yeah, just the immense sadness that alone must, that memory, that loss, that pain, and the understandable anger that could come with that. I'm always interested. I think, this idea we talked about earlier that Aotearoa New Zealand, we're so much better than Australia. Our white people are so much better, so much more righteous. We get the we get the silver medal in racism, and Australia gets the gold, and actually the States probably takes the gold, to be honest, and Canada gets in there somewhere on the podium. But that 1803, the British turn up with a mind to exterminate. Terra nullius. These aren't humans, these are flora and fauna, we're just going to eradicate them. 40 years later, here in Aotearoa, they're signing a treaty. And they're signing treaties all across the world by that time. Lots of reasons. Everything from it was easy to get a colony by treaty, and Canada, they signed heaps of them and just ignored them, same with the States, right? But also they had, there's a theology, the Clapham sect said, actually, they are human. These are God's creatures like us, and we need to be, acknowledge that in our relationships. And so the Treaty of Waitangi is infused with this theology, this Christian thinking that actually Māori have a society that we should honour. They have land rights because they have a social structure. Whereas, because it was 40 years earlier with you guys, you got the... But then by 1870 here in Aotearoa, our Chief Justice Prendergast is saying that treaty's not valid because Māori would never have been civilised enough to be able to sign a treaty. That amazing waves that history comes in, right? So, you guys get the bad end. We hit the peak, then we come down into the trough, and we can talk soon about whether we're peaking or troughing and where that all goes as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I think I think it's good for our whānau listening to really understand just how brutal it was and the scale of the destruction. You can imagine going through villages, food collection sites, and everyone's gone. And the loss that the survivors would have faced, and the intergenerational trauma wouldn't come close to...
And of course, genocide and ecocide always go together. And so the destruction of our food sources made it very, very difficult for us to survive in a traditional way on our lands. So inevitably we had to, start raiding white settlements and stealing sheep and those sorts of things because our own traditional food sources had been destroyed. Our agriculture had been destroyed by sheep and cattle stampeding through the bush and destroying all of the sort of ground cover yams and things like that we would have traditionally eaten. And in the first 20 or 30 years of white settlement, They pretty much almost wiped out kangaroo, which is a major protein source for us. Drove kangaroo almost to the point of extinction, and that has a massive effect on our capacity to feed ourselves and so forth. So ecocide, genocide are kind of one side of each side of one coin, and that was definitely our experience in Tasmania. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just incredibly saddening, just to contemplate that and what humanity's capable of.
Yeah.
Still, we're seeing it in Gaza now.
Yeah.
We're seeing it in the Ukraine. We're seeing it all around the world, right? Sudan, funded by global politics and money and oil, and so.
Yep.
Yeah.
The fight for land and resources. That's what's at the heart of it all, I think.
And we're not learning much. So, and then, but some of our ancestors do survive, but then they're incorporated into capitalism as well. They've got to join the money economy and become dependent on, being a proletariat and getting a job somewhere.
And often Christianity is capitalism, So, like with many other groups all around the world, including here, the survivors of our frontier conflicts were sort of rounded up, taken to an island offshore, Flinders Island, it's called now, and basically put in a sort of concentration camp / mission that was run by an Anglican layman, and they were taught, to be civilized, and Christianity was the means of civilization. And so our mob, along with many other mobs around Australia and around the world, were kind of forbidden from practicing our own culture and told that we must practice this other culture, which was Christianity in a particularly kind of capitalistic form, and so that's part of our legacy as well. To this very day, the national census that happens once every sort of 4 or 5 years in Australia, most mob will say that they are Christian. 76% of us will say that we're Christian.
Wow.
Now, what that means in reality, there's not many mob turn up to church in most places, but that legacy of the missions has had a profound effect upon us. Yeah. So,
was it the first Prime Minister of Canada? Said we'll get the Anglicans to do that work because they believe in it and they're cheap. Which again, we're both Anglicans, Anglican priests, Anglican leadership in various ways, and complicit, to some degree. So,
yeah, that's right.
I'd high five you if it wasn't so awkward. So that's great. So your ancestors are being Christianized, which, like you're saying, means being inculcated into the capitalist political economy, and their own values, beliefs eradicated, stripped from them, indoctrinated from them. And then, but they're surviving, and they know who they are, but they might have lost, language and, like you said, and
huge loss.
But also creating a new people with the Irish settlers there, which is maybe something beautiful. You've got to find some beauty in there somewhere.
And I think there was this. I mean, if you talk to a lot of the sort of Irish Aboriginal families, particularly in the southeast of Australia, it really was this common experience of the British, because in the early 1800s, of course, Ireland is very much a British colony, and the Irish people are being moved around all over the place. That expression beyond the pale, that means there was a boundary outside of Dublin where the less than human lived. Inside the pale was where the British lived, that kind of stuff. So there was an apartheid society being set up in Ireland. So I think a lot of the Irish convicts that came out here, particularly to Tasmania with that sort of fighting the British background, political prisoners, there was a common feeling, and so alliances were made, and it made a lot of sense.
And being starved out with a potato famine, and just yeah. Although I would note, most of like New Zealand actually comes from the English.
Mm.
But after, watching enough Mel Gibson movies, no one ever wants to be the English, no one wants to be the oppressor, everyone wants to be the oppressor.
Well, these days some of the English don't want to be English, especially the Cornish.
Yeah. Oh, unfortunately, I'm from Liverpool, so my Parker ancestors, so yeah.
Yes.
You get what you get.
Yeah.
And so you come into existence, and you tell us a bit about, growing up, knowing that you are, part of your mob. But what did that feel like? What were there moments of fear? You couldn't be proud of it publicly.
It was very hard to be proud of it publicly. I mean, privately as a family, we tried to hang on to things and we told stories, and it was all about hanging on to who we are and that sort of thing. But publicly, as I was growing up in the sort of 1980s, it still wasn't safe to publicly identify as Aboriginal because you would be victimised because of that. And there was also a real fear, of course, particularly amongst our elders, that if you identified publicly as Aboriginal, then you would draw the attention of the welfare authorities who might take your children away, because there was a long period in Australia's history of child removals as part of an assimilationist project. If you take children away from their parents, then you can raise them white and you breed the Aboriginal culture out of them, that kind of stuff. So the combination of all of those sorts of fears meant that we tended to keep it under our hats, as it were. But I suppose my generation is probably the emerging generation. We grew up with that fear, but the pull of the past and the pull of who we are and the pull of justice really took us out of ourselves and meant that we became a generation of activists who tried to change things. And so I'm part of that generation. I'm really, really glad that my own kids can build on that. They can stand on our shoulders. We stood on the shoulders of the elders that were before us. And it's just a little bit easier for my kids, It's still hard in lots of ways. But I feel like with each generation, we're getting stronger. We're recovering culture. We're learning language. We're developing our own frameworks. We're recovering Indigenous knowledges. We're creating new Indigenous knowledges. We're applying those. We're applying that to medicine, to engineering, to spirituality, to all the fields of human endeavour, and we're getting stronger. So I'm really, really proud of my kids and the contribution they're making as well.
Kia ora.
Yeah.
Kia ora. And really want to explore some of that in our kōrero today. And so, you're growing up in this generation that's increasingly confident in asserting who you are and who you can be as a people. Any thoughts about the place of kind of international solidarity in that? The movements are emerging around the world. I mean, even here in Aotearoa, like that must have given you some confidence that you weren't alone in this experience and in this kind of endeavour.
Yeah, I mean, I was certainly aware as a young student in particular that there were liberation movements going on all over the world. Of course, we were all exposed to the civil rights movement with Malcolm X and JFK in America because they had cameras and radio shows, right? So we heard about it. But you tended to have to be a student and read about the liberation movements in South America or in Africa. So I think it was really only as a student that I started to read about that stuff. And interestingly for me, I guess a way into that was through theology. So when I was a young student at university, the first person in my entire family to have ever gone to university I sort of stumbled across, liberation theologians and liberation educationalists, and they kind of opened up the world of sort of Marxist analysis and all that sort of stuff. Came across Anton Gramsci and the idea of the organic intellectual, the activist intellectual, and those sorts of things. So all of that was sort of playing around, I think, in the conversations that we had when we were younger. In time, we realised that that even though there was solidarity internationally, we still had to apply our own local knowledges, our own local frameworks, our own particular way of being Indigenous in order for us to get to where we wanted to get to. So, yes, the international solidarity is there and there's a commonality there, but in the end, the answer has to be local. It has to be our knowledges, the way we've managed this country for thousands of years, the way we live in it, the hope that we can give to our children through that. And actually, through that, we can offer a gift to settler society as well, which is imploding, So that kind of thing comes into play.
So the specificity of place. Yeah. And so you went to university in Hobart?
Yes, Nipaluna, Hobart.
Nipaluna.
Nipaluna is our word for that
Hobart.
area,
Right,
for Hobart,
right.
yeah. And, that was a big deal. That was a big deal because, my family, those of us who had work, it was labouring work, factory work, working in sawmills, putting in sewerage lines, that sort of work. Going out of the bush, wood chopping, fuel, those sorts of things. So it was a big deal for me to go to university and a huge culture shock. Got a scholarship. Off I went with the encouragement of my parents and the local pastor in the church. Off to university I go, and who do I meet there? The descendants of the landed gentry. So huge culture shock. This Aboriginal kid without a brass razoo amongst all these other kids with cars and money and knowledge about all sorts of things that I've never heard of, and it was a very, very big culture shock for me. But at the same time, I'm innately curious, and from a young kid, I'd always been a reader, so I just soaked up everything that I possibly could while I was at university. And it was really when I was at university, it was really at the very, very beginning of what we call Indigenous studies in Australia, where there was a developing academic discipline around interrogating our own history, our own knowledges, our own way of doing things, our own frameworks. And I just caught the beginning of that at university that first time around. And that was exciting. As that was sort of just starting to get off the ground. So yeah, a really formative time for me. Incredible culture shock, but at the same time, I guess I picked up some cultural capital about how to keep going in this sort of world and of learning and scholarship. Yeah,
and again, your people like ours, Māori were going to be the hewers of wood and the carriers of water, and that was our destiny, to be the working class proletariat that would feed the capitalist.
Yeah.
And yet education was, seen by, our leadership as the way out of that particular trap as well. And so you, and then you moved to Melbourne.
Yes. Yeah, so a very brief career as a school teacher, which didn't go particularly well because I was only 4 years older than the kids I was teaching, and they could see right through me and all that sort of stuff. But because of really the example and the model of a pastor that we had in our church, when I was a little bit younger, I'd sort of, I thought I could do that. I could be that kind of person. I liked the pastor figure as someone who's engaged in the community, who tries to help in practical ways, but is also a bit of a scholar, who represents a wider world of sort of thinking and perspective in a local place, and tries to bring that stuff to bear in helpful ways practically. And I thought, yes, I can do that, you know. So an emerging sense of vocation came out of that. And so when my wife and I did move to Melbourne, again, that was a huge culture shock because, you know, the total population of Lutruwita, Tasmania is like 475,000. You move to Melbourne, population 4 million, you know, and very different landscape, very flat. Can't see the water and the mountains from everywhere like you can where I came from. Whole new relationships to be formed, etc., etc. But another great adventure, and for me, that meant sort of entering into formal theological education for the first time, and I studied initially with a Baptist college as part of the Melbourne College of Divinity, and you know, if you talk to any of my teachers from that time, they will tell you that I was a right pain in the ass, you know.
I can't imagine it.
Well, because I just had this very, very different background and cultural experience to most of the students they were dealing with. So I was asking different questions and I wasn't settling for the answers I was getting, you know, whereas most of the others had been trained to be sort of middle class and you know, receptive and all that sort of thing, whereas I was going at it like a dog with a bone. And
they just wanted to do it better.
Yeah.
Whereas you're like, why are we doing it?
Yeah, exactly. So they will all tell you that I was a right pain in the ass as a student, but I was a really good student. I did really, really well, you know, and I certainly got out of that what I wanted from it, which was to sort of really to pick up on the more radical elements in Christianity, the Christianity that was about land and people and learning from land. I keep saying to people, if you look at the preaching of Jesus as it's recorded in the Gospels, he very rarely takes a text and preaches on a text. Most of the time his text is country, what we call country. It's what's going on in the land. And he takes lessons from that and teaches people. I can understand that as an Aboriginal person because that's how our elders teach us. They look at what's happening in land, in country, and they teach us how to live in a way that imitates country. And as far as I can see, that's what the Christianity of Jesus was.
That is, yes, that's a brilliant point. When you talk about land, would you include whakapapa, you know, maybe genealogy, the kind of the stories of the ancestors of the land
Yes,
as well? So,
yes. So in the way we think about what we call country in Aboriginal English, we in our sort of dreaming stories, there are these sort of creator ancestor figures who are sort of hybrid human-animal kind of creatures, and they're very powerful and they form the landscape. And after they form the landscape and they teach the first people how to live in that landscape, they lie down, as it were, in the landscape and they become the landscape. And so their wisdom is always available to us because they continue to speak from the land. So there's a sense in which our ancestors are always embedded in land. And so the land is never just simply object to be exploited. It is kin, you know. So we learn from kin and we respect kin and we look after kin because they look after us. And our concept of country or land or seascape is that, a kinship thing.
well, I mean, you know, and it would be very similar with
Yes.
Hartswell with, unless there's iron ore or uranium in their lands and country, in which case,
Yeah.
let's dig it up and give it to the rich people.
Yeah.
You know, like just the level of spiritual desecration with the environment, not just the physical. Right? So, what's happening there, and the destruction of that story and of that kind of spiritual resource that it represents.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Jesus is, this Jew, this Indigenous person who's talking of country and preaching of country, and he might be quoting from Isaiah now and again, but he's also. And then you saw yourself in those stories. How do you? This is always the question, I suppose, and the challenge. Me too. How do you reconcile, this Jesus with this connection, this empowerment of your own Indigenous knowledge and worldview with the missionaries' Jesus, which was used to eradicate that worldview? How do we bring the two together?
In my case, we don't. There can be no reconciliation between those because the missionary Jesus is essentially a controlling deity who wants you to empty yourself of everything that is actually yours and replace it with what belongs to someone else. And I feel like Feuerbach was absolutely right when he said that European Christianity projected itself into the heavens and called it God, Thankfully, I think in the biblical narratives and in the traditions of Christianity, there's enough in there to claim a Jesus and indeed a divinity against that kind of controlling deity, a prophet who speaks for and from country, a prophet who invites people to look out for the last and the least, including the last and the least, which is country, an ancestor figure who can call us to responsibility for our family, our kin, the matrix in which we're all embedded, to find our part in taking care of all of these things in the deepest possible sense. So I feel like I'm a Christian insofar as I can find an ally in those texts and in that Jesus, but I feel very little kinship with the sort of missionary control kind of agenda at all. And insofar as the contemporary church continues to replicate that model, and it still does, I won't have anything to do with it, because I feel like it's like the thief who comes to steal and kill and destroy. And whereas I am on about a prophet who heals and beckons into life in all its fullness, if you want to use that Johannine language.
So, to really get us in trouble then,
Yeah.
how might you deal with the creeds?
Creeds? Well, look, I spent a considerable part of my life thinking about the origins of the creeds in baptismal rituals. And so I think if the creeds are understood as very, very, very general, culturally specific affirmations within a particular kind of culture in the sort of Mediterranean world around formation and baptism, then they make sense. And I think that the wisdom of preparing people for membership in the tribe and their responsibilities in the tribe and using a water ritual to do it and creeds as a kind of a knowledges framework, we can do that. But does it have to be exactly the same as the choices that were made by churches around the Mediterranean in the 3rd and 4th centuries? I don't think so. So I think the notion of tradition and creed and baptismal formational rituals can be taken elsewhere, and we can discover that our own Indigenous cultures have done very much the same with our own knowledges, you know. In Indigenous cultures in Australia, kids around 12 or 13, boys and girls, taken off by our elders, and they are inducted into the knowledge of the tribe and their particular place by virtue of their birth and family in looking after the country that you're on. There's usually water rituals involved. You know, there's scarification rituals where the stories of the tribe are written on your skin. You know, it's our equivalent to sort of tattoo, that kind of thing. And all of this is about taking on your responsibility as part of the care for country. And so we have our own rituals that do that. If you can understand creeds and baptismal rituals as things that made sense in an ancient Mediterranean culture, but not feel the need to bring that and just dump it on top of our culture, but translate it into something that makes sense for us in our own frameworks, I think there's plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I just reflecting on that and thinking that's much to think about. I did a baptism on Saturday. Baby, this girl, she's wearing her beautiful Niuean necklace because that's part of her whakapapa. Her Tongan mat, that's part of her whakapapa. Her Ngāpuhi attitude, because they're angry people, like those northerners. And, but she had it all.
Yeah.
And then, the kind of naming of that whakapapa and naming of God and creation in that story was a beautiful moment, with the whānau gathered around to affirm that belonging, But yeah, the idea that we have to do it exactly always strikes me as partly Pākehā white people's inability to understand their own cultural context. Like, no, this isn't us. This is universal. It's like, no, it's definitely you. We see it as you. You just don't understand yourselves. Whereas, we're supposed to be the exotic ones sitting outside of that.
Yeah.
It's just a fascinating.
Yeah.
The ignorance is.
Yeah.
Being so ignorant must be blissful. Like, I wish I could.
Ignorance is bliss, I'm told.
Yeah, I wish I could embrace it.
That's what I'm told.
Yeah. Shame we're both geniuses. And humble. Just that there's an element. Now, this gets into really tricky territory, but an element where the gospel can also, and has been for our people, gives us not only an ability to critique, understand the colonizer, but also an ability to critique ourselves, our own culture, to find it limiting. So the classic for us was kai tangata, eating of human flesh, and which we'd done for generations, was a key religious practice effectively. And yet, really with the gospel, we said, it's not life-giving. Let's stop it, and there were no missionaries really involved in that decision-making, not in our tribal story. We just said, it's not good for us. Let's just not do it anymore. And the gospel gave us a lens to kind of be able to do that critique. Any thoughts about, and of course, though, that starts aligning with all the terrible white nationalists, like your culture is terrible and we saved you from yourselves and, And yet I think it's important that we're honest about, our culture could be imperfect. No culture is perfect. We could be, the powerful could dominate the weak. The strong could dominate, every culture is capable of that. Any thoughts about, how we can critique ourselves without it being taken to assume that our entire culture is worthless and needed to be saved from ourselves?
Yeah. Look, I think every living culture learns from encounters with difference. Now, I've heard Pacifica elders from, all over that ocean talk in similar terms about some of the good things that Christianity brought, particularly if you emphasise that these decisions were made by the people themselves rather than by their sort of colonial masters. I think that highlights the fact that all living cultures are capable of seeing the good in an encounter with otherness and going, actually, we can learn something from that. We don't need to literally eat the flesh of our kin. We can eat the symbolic flesh of Christ instead, who stands in for our kin, in a sense. So there are ways of sort of moving the culture on in ways that work towards a sort of newly opening horizon of peace and even perhaps of forgiveness and the treating of enemies as friends and those sorts of things, all of which are, I think, very, very positive. Now, Aboriginal culture, we, as far as I can tell, and as far as most of my scholar friends can tell, there doesn't seem to have been a practice like cannibalism as part of our traditional way of life. But there certainly were tribal wars. The interesting thing in Aboriginal culture around some of these tribal conflicts is it would often be about resources, and it would sometimes be about the resource of fertility represented by women, and those sorts of things, and these would cause conflict. But interestingly, there would often be a kind of a ritual resolution to these conflicts rather than, everyone having to sort of wipe each other's families out. So we're not quite sure how long ago it happened, but there clearly was some kind of move, probably 10 to 15,000 years ago, where some of these things went from being literal conflicts to sort of ritual conflicts. And there would be a representative from the two groups who would fight. And there would even be a ritual fight, so one person would spear the leg of the other and that kind of thing, but in a non-fatal way. Now, why that came about, no one really knows. But I feel like the kind of thing that we know happens where you encounter a new idea from another group can make all the difference, and it sort of opens up a horizon. So I think the thing to focus on here is that all living cultures innovate. All living cultures, if they come across a better idea, will embrace it and learn how to do it. And I think that the encounter with the positive aspects of Christianity is like that. So we don't always have to be thinking about Christianity as the great enemy, the great Satan, that comes and destroys everything. Because there's a lot of things about Christianity which I think are really, really good and do have a positive influence and have had a positive influence on our people as well.
Yeah, the major resistance movements in the 19th century and Aotearoa were all inspired by Scripture. The King movement, it's not a European king, it's Deuteronomy, it's a biblical idea of king. The Queen was just, crowned with a Bible. These are key ideas, key drivers, the prophetic movements are all scriptural as well as our own Indigenous ancient worldview knowledge. So, it's a complicated little mix. I think we get a bit simplistic, Well, if Christianity is the cause of all our problems, we just got to remove that and we'll be back. Okay, but you want to keep capitalism, all elements of it. There's just this, it's complicated.
Our elders who were highly missionised would use scripture to argue our case, So, amongst the Wurundjeri, who are the traditional owner group of Naarm or Melbourne, there was a chap called Simon Wonga, who was one of the last sort of, traditional tribal leaders of the Wurundjeri, who was well versed in scripture. And when he was arguing for a place for his tribe to live unmolested, he invoked the notion of that part of Egypt where the Hebrews were allowed to settle unmolested, albeit briefly. But he invoked that idea as he was, his Goshen.
Mm.
We want a Goshen where we can live unmolested amongst you,
Mm.
So we've always used the language and the social imaginary of the colonizer to argue our case as well,
Well, we were told it
Yeah.
was their sacred language.
Yeah.
We didn't realise they didn't mean it. They had their fingers crossed, like
behind their backs.
Yeah.
That's
I
right.
know we're just jokes, lol.
Yeah.
Like that was the seemed to, and always, yes, we were eating human flesh. 100 years later, Europe's having World War One, killing 10,000 young men a day, so they can take their drinks cabinet 3 meters closer to Berlin. Just the pointlessness, the scale of the massacre. I mean, if that's civilization, I'd hate to see uncivilized.
Exactly.
So,
Right.
all of those arguments. So we get to today, and you've already, alluded and given us some description, some hopeful description of, not just the rebuilding, reimagination of Indigenous culture amongst, Indigenous peoples, but also its potential to influence, white, non-Indigenous Australia. What do you think the potential is there for the kind of indigenisation of Australia?
Well, as always, these things come about through choices, but you've got to present the options. I think one of the great gifts of Indigenous Australia to settlement Australia, if you like, is our knowledge around caring for the environment, caring for country, because Australia, like so many other places in the world, is on the brink of a kind of environmental apocalypse. Desertification, salinisation of the soil, rivers where there's massive fish kills because there's so much runoff from agricultural fertilisation projects into rivers. It's creating algal blooms, killing the fish. Australia leads the world in terms of the rate of extinction of native species. All of these things, bushfires that burn so hot that they destroy 12 metres of substrata under the soil, as well as everything on top of the soil, because of the mismanagement of native bush. All of these things are happening in Australia. The bushfires that happened back in 2019, 2020, and an area the size of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island in Canada, millions and millions and millions of hectares. And a lot of that stuff will never grow there again because it's just done so much damage. So we have a long history of managing the Australian environment in a way that allowed it to flourish, that allowed native species to thrive. We had a sense of what was enough to take for ourselves, and we had this sense that we were giving thanks to our ancestors as we took it. But we knew that we had to look after the interests of future generations, not only for human beings, but also for all the other species. That was all embedded into the way that we managed country. We did farm country. There's this myth in Australia that we were hunter-gatherers who never actually had a big impact on the landscape. We did. We farmed country. We grew things. We used fire to develop places where certain species would thrive. And we had a sense of what the symbiotic relationship was between species and plants. And we encouraged those matrices of sort of mutual dependence. So we have this long, long history of managing that continent very, very well. We have a gift to offer Australia in this time of ecological apocalypse, And Indigenous people around the world have that long experience of managing country where they are that they can offer to their governments and their settled societies as well. So I really feel like if we are to tackle this most major issue, which is affecting us globally as well as locally, this is where the gift of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous experience is absolutely at the fore. And the question therefore becomes, will that gift be received? And that is an issue in Australia as it is in every other place.
Yes. Now, we don't want to invoke Trump more than once. But, we're in this moment. I mean, I was watching, the debate around the voice in Australia, having a voice in Parliament for Indigenous peoples, and so hopeful, when Liberal and the Liberal Party, Labor, National, are all going to support. And I was like, what? Like, this is amazing. Minimal, as you said, but still, unprecedented.
Yep.
So hopeful, like we're on this tipping point here in Aotearoa, things where legislation, Māori knowledge, ways of being is compulsory in the legal teaching now, the legal profession. The languages, the warehouse sells out of merchandise every Māori language week now, just straight away, like boom, it's gone. And these are non-Māori buying the tracksuits. And, there are these signs, portents of massive change, of the embrace of the Indigenous. Matariki becomes a holiday. And kind of then we get COVID and it brings out the crazy, and then the corporations see how they can cash in, and you get the Trumps and the nationalists, and suddenly we see them flying, and then the voice loses, and then you've got in Australia signs up to AUKUS Nuclear Submarines Pact, which ties Australia into the Anglo Empire for generations to come. I mean, what is it, like 150-year plan with these, nuclear?
Yeah.
It seems to have not just ground to a halt, and then you've got in the most recent polls, Pauline Hanson and One Australia rocketing up the polls. Like they're more popular than Labor now, aren't they, or something crazy like that. Like,
not quite, but certainly more popular than the Liberal Party and the National Party.
And Liberal, which is incredibly powerful, just like a year ago, right? Well, the potential was. So, maybe more than a year, but where's the hope gone? Should we give up? Is this inevitable? Do we give in to our despair?
Yeah.
Is this...
Well, look, when the voice referendum failed, all of us old campaigners, all of us crusty old campaigners kind of knew it would. We knew it would fail because historically you've got to have bipartisan support for any referendum to change the Constitution. Now, this was minimal and largely symbolic change. It was about a advisory committee to government that had no power in and of itself, and it would be enshrined in the Constitution so that government would at least have to consult this committee. It could continue to ignore it, but it would be there in the Constitution. Because the Constitution had to be changed in order to enact this, we needed bipartisan support. The whole idea began in a series of conversations that happened from about 2015 on. And there was bipartisan support for that process right up until probably 2 years before the referendum was actually held. And then the Liberal Party and the National Party pulled out. We knew immediately that was probably the end of it. Now, of course, we continued to campaign. A lot of us as leaders were going around the country and talking to our constituencies and anyone else who would listen about what the proposals were and what they meant and what they didn't mean and all that sort of stuff. We worked hard, but we kind of knew in our hearts it wasn't going to get there. Our younger people were devastated, devastated, because they really felt like this was going to be the big change that would make life so much better for everyone moving forward. And so, my kids were devastated. My daughter was involved in door knocking, going around Hobart, my older daughter, and she was very involved in the campaigning, and both she and my other daughter and many of their contemporaries were absolutely devastated. And they asked that question, where's the hope? What's the hope for the future? So really, all of us old crusty activists just had to sit down with these young people and say, look, this is a long struggle. It's been a long struggle to get to this point. It will continue to be a long struggle. But things are better now than they used to be. It's a lot harder for the government to take away our kids now. They still do it, but it's a lot harder for them to do it now. Our socioeconomic circumstances are better than they were 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago. It's now possible to identify as Aboriginal in public, and you survive. Things are better. So we just sat them down and we talked about this much bigger story, this bigger picture, and just kind of said to them, things do get better. It's just that it happens incrementally, and you have to keep fighting for it because they're not going to give it to you. You have to keep fighting for it. We're the ones who make our future, so we have to keep working at it, So, and I think that's really, really the situation now, There were moments of great hope in the last sort of 30 to 40 years. Prime Minister Keating's Redfern speech back in 1992 was a moment where many of us thought everything was going to change, but it didn't. His government was voted out. Then we had a long period of Conservative government, and really they took back the reconciliation cause back to almost zero while they were there. Then there was again that moment of hope as the conversation around the referendum and the voice got off the ground. But then, because of a whole bunch of factors, not least that the Conservative side of politics ended up campaigning against it rather than supporting it, meant that we didn't get there as well. Again, I think education is a key, and there are some choices around that for the Australian community as a whole. There's a big divide in Australia in educational terms, and the big divide is basically the inner city versus everyone else. So if you go to a state school or a private school in inner city, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Adelaide, Perth, you're going to learn a lot about the history of Australia, including our history. But if you go to any other school, you won't, because they'll see that as an added extra. And so there remains a lot of ignorance about the history of our country and what kind of future necessarily follows through choice from that history. And so I think that Australia, if it made a big investment in those very, very poor and very ignorant parts of the country, then that could all turn around in a generation. But that may not happen because the billionaires are in charge again. The billionaires are in charge of the media. The billionaires are in charge of social media. The billionaires are in charge of fundraising for elections, and that's very, very worrying, I think.
The truth will set you free eventually, Australia. And just maybe finally, so what could people do? What could particularly non-Indigenous people do? And maybe we could use that most atrophied of institutions, the Anglican Church, as a kind of example of like a microcosm of like what could it do, what could the people in there do, if they want justice, if they want change, transformation, what are the actions they could take?
Yeah. Well, look, I say to people, it all comes down to relationship, and relationship on our terms rather than your terms, you know. So rather than, you know, get your local Aboriginal leader to come and give a token talk once a year during NAIDOC week or Reconciliation week or whatever it is that you celebrate in your church, and therefore really have no meaningful engagement. Why don't some of you just decide that this year we're going to turn up to stuff that local mob run, you know, and just keep our mouths shut and just listen and learn for a year. I say to people, if you could commit to that, then A, you'll learn a lot of things you didn't know before about both the past but also the present and what we want for the future. But B, you'll also find lots of ways that you can contribute at a basic human-to-human relational level to making that future come about, just by being in the sort of kinship group that local Aboriginal organisation is trying to foster, you know, because we want settlers to get on board with the vision. We want to be in relationship with settlers. In Australia, we're only 3.5% of the population. We can't imagine the future without settlers. We need allies to be on board, but we need those allies to be people who are taking the lead from us rather than doing the old missionary thing of coming in and telling us how we ought to do things. So I say to people, just covenant to shut your mouth for a year and go to what we're doing, to our gatherings, to our stuff, the things that we're doing, the things that we think are important, rather than just this token, let's get an Aborigine to come and talk to us in NAIDOC week. And that could make all the difference.
So build relationships.
Build relationships.
Yeah, and put that time commitment in.
Yeah.
Well, you know, thank you for, you know, at least offering a way, you know, rather than saying there is no way. It's hopeless. So, well, I might just finish with a brief benediction, if that's all right.
Sure.
So, anorera toitu te rangi, the sky endures, toitu te whenua, the land remains. Toitu te araho o te atua, God's love is constant. Toitu ona manakitanga kairunga a tātou katoa, and his blessings remain on us all. Mauri ore te atua, hail, O God, matua tama wairua tapu. Āmene.